Well, would you join me in the book of Mark for our message this morning? Mark chapter 3. We're starting Mark chapter 3 this morning. We're going to look at the first 6 verses. Our text this morning once again finds Jesus in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Now, while he is there, he performs a great miracle. But unfortunately, this marvelous act of healing and grace is overshadowed by the hatred and the suspicion of the Pharisees. Now, our studies in chapter 2, if you'll remember, revealed the struggles that Jesus faced. He's been confronted by the Pharisees on a number of occasions. And these struggles continue as we move into chapter 3. Now, while these confrontations begin early on in Jesus' ministry, he's going to face them, as we've mentioned before, until he offers himself up as a sacrifice on the cross. Confrontation, suspicion, hatred by others, skepticism. This followed Jesus everywhere he went. Now, you and I face those types of things occasionally. And while it is never easy to face opposition, especially when you're doing what's right, I think there is comfort in knowing that Jesus endured those same difficulties. And so when we go through them, he knows what it's like. So hopefully our study today will offer you some insight into the struggles that we face, but also offer you a renewed confidence in the Lord. I want to consider the challenges revealed in this text as we consider Jesus hated for healing. In Mark chapter 3, in the first couple of verses, we see the dilemma that Jesus faced. Mark 3, verses 1 and 2. It says, "He entered again into the synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him." When it says they, it's talking about the Pharisees here. So you'll know who he's talking about. So here it is. Jesus is once again in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And as he enters the synagogue, he immediately encounters a dilemma. And this dilemma really is twofold. In the first verse, we see that he encounters a physical handicap. There is a man with a hand that it says that hand is withered. In some way, that hand is either paralyzed or handicapped or injured in some way. We're not told the details of it, but there is an injury there. There is a problem with this man's hand. Now, among those in the synagogue that day, not only were there this man in verse 1, but verse 2 tells us that there were the Pharisees. They were watching him. Now, when Jesus encounters this man with this physical handicap, no doubt it was a concern for that man. I mean, if you were in that position, you had a physical problem with you of some way, it's a concern. If it can be fixed, you'd like it fixed. We're all that way, right? I mean, if I've got something wrong with me physically going on and it can be fixed, I want it fixed. Well, I'm sure the man was the same way. Certainly that would have hindered his ability to work, having a handicapped hand. It would have hindered his ability to provide for his family, perhaps. Clearly, he stood in need of a touch from the Lord, and he's about to get one as Jesus encounters him that day in the synagogue. But not only does Jesus encounter a physical handicap, he also, as we see in verse 2, encounters a spiritual hypocrisy. Verse 2 tells us that these Pharisees were watching him. They were watching him to see whether or not he would heal this man on the Sabbath. Notice it doesn't say that they were watching to see if he could heal. They'd already seen Jesus heal. They cannot deny Jesus has the ability to heal. What they were wanting to know is, will he heal on the Sabbath? Their watchful eye is not out of concern for this man, but seeking yet another occasion to bring accusation against Jesus. Now, these supposed spiritual leaders, they're not concerned with the needs of humanity. Instead, they're seeking to discredit the Son of God. Their hearts were not focused on worship that day as they entered the synagogue, but intense scrutiny of Jesus as to accuse him. We have to be careful that we guard our hearts as we seek to worship and serve the Lord. And if we're not careful, we can easily allow hypocrisy into our life. Personal agendas to hinder our pursuit of Christ and our service for Him. See, that's what's going on here with these Pharisees. It's spiritual hypocrisy. They're supposed to be the leaders, the ones who are teaching the Word of God, the ones who are drawing people to Christ, the ones who are concerned not only about people's hearts, their spiritual condition, but also just about people in general. And yet they don't care nothing about this man. They don't care anything about him physically. They don't care about anything about him spiritually. He's a pawn in this game that they're playing. All they're trying to do is discredit Jesus. And so this is the dilemma that Jesus faces as he enters the synagogue on that Sabbath. In the next couple of verses, we see the determination that Jesus revealed. Jesus is well aware of the Pharisees that day. He's well aware of the hardness of their hearts. He's well aware of what their intentions are. And yet Jesus remains committed to fulfilling the Father's plan. He refuses to allow opposition of some to hinder his ministry. Notice, first of all, his compassion in verse 3. As Jesus enters the synagogue, it says there in verse 3, he said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." Get up and come forward. Now keep in mind that the Pharisees, they're watching Jesus, right? They're watching his every move. They're waiting to see what he's going to do with this man. No doubt that they believed that Jesus would not ignore him. They've already watched Jesus for a time. They know his ways. They're familiar with his with what he does and his concern for people. So no doubt they believe that Jesus is not going to ignore this man. And they're right. Jesus does not ignore this man. When Jesus sees this man, he walks over to him and he gives him the command to get up and come to him. Without saying anything else, the man immediately knew Jesus had recognized his need. It appeared that he was going to be provided something that he needed. And so he gets up and goes over to Jesus. Now, I'm sure that there were many that day in the synagogue who didn't think all that much of this man's need. But I assure you, to that man, it was important. And to Jesus, it was important. And I am glad that Jesus is aware of every need that I have. I'm glad Jesus is aware of the needs I have that I don't even know I have. And I'm glad that He is fully capable to meet every need. No matter how big, no matter how small that need may be, Jesus is fully aware of it and desires to meet it. He's interested in the seemingly insignificant needs. But He's also more than able to meet the seemingly impossible needs. And so Jesus goes over to that man and shows compassion. In verse 4, we see that his decision. He said to them, the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save a life or to kill?" But they kept silent. After looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Now, before saying anything else to this man, right? Let's kind of back up and just review the scenario here, the scene. Jesus walks into the synagogue. He sees this man with the withered hand, with the handicapped hand. He looks over at that man. He says, "Get up and come to me." The man gets up and goes to Jesus, and without saying a word to the man, he looks to the Pharisees and he says, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm? To save a life or to kill on the Sabbath?" And they say nothing. They keep silent. And so he turns to the man and he says, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched out his hand and it was healed. Jesus first makes the decision to confront the hypocrisy in the Pharisees' lives, their lack of concern for this man. Once again, Jesus was forced to address the same accusation that He previously faced regarding the disciples picking grain on the Sabbath. Jesus knows it's the Sabbath. But He also knows that God had not forbidden Him from doing good and healing on the Sabbath. And as was the case, the Pharisees refused to respond. Jesus asked them, is it lawful? Is it okay to do good on the Sabbath? To heal? And they don't respond. They keep silent. Jesus asked the Pharisees to interpret the law for them. You know the law, He says. At least you claim to know the law. You've burdened all these people with dozens and dozens of extra laws. So you interpret the law for me. But you see, it was an impossible question for them to answer. You see, if they answered what the question obviously demanded was, no, it's not wrong, it's okay to do these things, then they'd have to admit to more than they were willing to admit at this point. So the text tells us that they kept silent. Now the word used there for silent has the sense of a determined, continued silence. This was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say or didn't know what to say. This was the silence of someone who was in rebellion and refused to answer. You know the difference? Sometimes we're asked a question and we just don't know the answer. We're just not sure what to say. But then there are other times when we're asked a question and we know the answer, and we know what the right thing to say is, and yet we remain silent. We rebel. We refuse to answer. That was the case with the Pharisees that day. Their attitudes, their accusations grieved Jesus, it says. He was troubled in his heart. He was angered by their rebellion and their lack of concern and their hypocrisy. You see, nothing's hidden from Jesus. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be guilty of intentionally grieving Jesus. Sure, there will be things that I'll do in my life that will grieve the heart of Jesus. But I don't want to intentionally do those things. But that's what these men were doing that day. Because of the hardness of their heart, because of their self-righteous attitude, Jesus was grieved, and then it angered him. And so after making the decision to initially confront the Pharisees, and they just keep silent, he then turns to the man in verse 5, and he offers his provision. In verse 5, at the end there, it says, he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Knowing that the Pharisees opposed everything that Jesus did, Jesus still refused to be discouraged by that. He turns to the man and he provides for this man. He's determined to heal the man, even if the Pharisees oppose. Because Jesus knew that it's more important to follow the Father's will, the Father's plan, than it was the will of man. Jesus refused to allow these men to hinder or intimidate him. He refused to make the man suffer even one day longer, simply to please the attitude of these self-righteous Pharisees. The man stood in need of healing, and Jesus provided. You know, the gospel today remains unpopular to many people. But Jesus continues to save, regardless of the attitude or opinions of men. The mission of the church is unpopular for many today. But we as a church must continue to do the Father's will, regardless of the unpopular opinions of the world around us, regardless of the attitudes, regardless of the of what may others may say or others may do, or how they may try to hinder or to discourage. And if we're honest, sometimes that discouragement and sometimes that hindrance comes from within the church. Sometimes there's an attitude within the church that says, you know what? They don't look like us, or they don't act like us, or they're not part of us. And so, yes, I realize that the gospel is for everyone, but let someone else reach them. And we need to be very careful about that hardness of heart and that attitude. It's a pharisaical type attitude. The Word of God says, go into all the nations and preach the gospel. And in America, we have the unique situation where many of the nations are coming to us. We cannot no longer be content to sit by and say we're happy with our small group, or we're happy with those, with friends that look like us and talk like us and dress like us and have the same likes and dislikes as us. We can no longer be content with that. We must reach out beyond our four walls, beyond our limited vision, and we must see what Jesus sees. And reach those around us. Jesus provided for this man's needs. He was not hindered by the thoughts and attitudes of the Pharisees. When you and I come to worship and when we leave to serve, we must not be hindered by the thoughts and attitudes of others, but rather focused on Jesus Christ and building His church. So Jesus heals this man. Now what happens? Well, in verse 6 we notice the disdain that Jesus endured. Verse 6 says, the Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him. Here we discover the rebellious attitude of the Pharisees. When they were confronted with the truth, they chose to reject truth. Notice, first of all, their haste. They were in a hurry to do this. It says in verse 6, the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against Jesus. They wasted no time. They left that synagogue that day in great haste and immediately conspired with the Herodians against Jesus. They wasted no time in forming a plan to oppose Jesus. They left the synagogue that day on a mission. We're going to destroy Jesus. They were determined to do everything they could to prevent Jesus' ministry from expanding. They stood against Jesus in everything that Jesus stood for. And that same type of resentment, that same type of opposition remains today. The church is opposed by Satan and those who are deceived by him. And if the Lord is at work in the life of an individual, if the Lord is at work in the life of a church, it will not be long until the enemy mounts an attack to hinder their efforts. They left in haste and began to formulate a plan. But notice also their hypocrisy. They immediately began to conspire with who? The Herodians. And you say, well, big deal. Yes, it was a big deal. This reveals how utterly hypocritical these men were. The Pharisees were regarded as those who knew the Word and lived in an effort to please God. Okay? They considered themselves people who knew the Word and lived in an effort to please God. And not only did they consider themselves that, they were highly regarded by others as that. Whether that's true or false, this is what they believed of themselves, and this is how others viewed them. Okay? Now, the Herodians, they were not a spiritual group. They were a political group. The Herodians were loyal to King Herod, hence the name Herodians. They were loyal to King Herod. They were sympathetic to the Romans. Now, not too far in the past, prior to this event, the Pharisees had condemned Jesus for sharing a meal with who? Tax collectors. People who were what? Sympathetic to Rome. Jesus is interacting with people who were sympathetic to Rome, who worked for the Roman government. He's sharing a meal with them. The Pharisees go nuts over this. How could you? How could Jesus be eating with tax collectors and sinners? That's unheard of. And yet, now, when it suits their purposes, the Pharisees are now conspiring with the Herodians, who are sympathetic to Rome and who would be very happy to promote the Roman government. So they agree. This is just how hypocritical this all is, and how bizarre all of this is. All because they want to get Jesus. They agree to work with and support a group who has fundamental doctrinal differences in an effort to destroy Jesus. They're willing to sacrifice their stance on the Word of God and a desire to please God in order to work with someone who has no desire for the Lord and who would seek to promote Rome. They would rather work with them so that they can destroy Jesus. Now, if we're honest, we have to admit that this same hypocrisy remains today. There are groups with fundamental differences who come together and they don't agree on anything else, but they're willing to come together in an effort to hinder the church and silence the promotion of the gospel. You see, sin has a way of creating strange alliances. And if we're not careful and we don't guard our own hearts, then we might get wrapped up in some of this. Not in an effort to destroy the church, necessarily. At least that's not what we set out to do. But sometimes we get wrapped up in our own agenda. Sometimes we get wrapped up in political things. And let me tell you, folks, any political agenda out there is not going to fix what the real need of people are. People need Jesus, and there is no political figure out there, there's no political group out there that's going to fix that with social laws or their own political agendas. It will not be fixed apart from the gospel of Jesus Christ. So don't look to politicians to fix what you deem as your most important needs. Jesus Christ has the answer. But you see, we get caught up in some of these things, and we begin to, and in doing so, and not intentionally maybe, but in doing so, we hinder what the church could do, the potential of the church. Because we say, oh, but I need this person to do this, and he's going to fix this for me, and she's going to solve this. And we get so wrapped up in that scene that we lose sight of the real mission of the church. Not only was there hypocrisy in these men, but hatred as well. These men were not content to just minimize the ministry of Jesus. Oh, no. No, they were committed to destroying Jesus, it says. So they get together with this group that is fundamentally different than them. They have fundamental doctrinal differences. One, the Herodians, a political group who seeks to promote Rome. The other, the Pharisees, supposed to be a spiritual group seeking to promote God, get together for the purpose of destroying Jesus, because they both have Jesus as an enemy in common. They don't just want Jesus thrown out of the synagogue. Oh no, they want Jesus dead. Clearly, they do not recognize Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah. They have no idea who they are dealing with. Mere mortals are conspiring in an effort to kill the Son of God. And yet again, their hatred further proves their hypocrisy. Men who were supposed to teach and promote the ways of God. Men who were supposed to teach and promote love. Men who were supposed to teach and promote following God and promoting God's agenda, now are conspiring to kill an innocent man. And what's worse, conspiring to kill the very Son of God. They proved that they would stop at nothing to advance their own cause. These were not servants of God. These were sinful men hidden in self-proclaimed righteousness. These men hated Jesus. And unfortunately, that same hatred for Christ and the church remains today. The world doesn't mind religion. The world is full of religion. They'll tolerate religion in almost any form. However, the world draws the line with Jesus. They're enraged when Jesus is proclaimed. Even in America today, religion is fine as long as you don't mention Jesus. And this hatred continues to increase as we get closer to the return of Christ. But you see, we have nothing to fear in the Lord. We must continue to proclaim the gospel from a heart of love, even when opposed, even when hated. And even if they take our lives, we'll then enter the presence of the Lord. I've read this passage many times, over and over and over. And I've always focused primarily on the healing of the withered hand. And it was a tremendous miracle, a tremendous act of grace and mercy on behalf of this man. But it's horribly overshadowed by the hatred of the Pharisees here. And Jesus was well aware of their hatred, and yet he remained steadfast in performing the work that he came to do. And he heals this man's hand, and in doing so, furthers his own ministry as he seeks to draw people to the Father. You see, because in healing this man, he further proves himself as the Son of God. We need to remain steadfast. We need to develop that same commitment. We cannot allow the hindrances of life to prevent our faithfulness to the work of God. We've been commissioned by Jesus Christ to build His church. And it's really a privilege that Jesus wants us to help in the building process of His church, His kingdom. And we cannot allow the hindrances of life to prevent our faithfulness to the work that we've received. If you're struggling this morning, if you're struggling with the resistance of others, you're struggling with the hatred of others, you're struggling with people that whether they're intending to do so or not, they just seem to be preventing the work of God to move forward. I encourage you to seek Jesus Christ, to seek His strength. Why? Because He encountered the same thing. And He will provide for every need that we face. But we have to come to Him by faith. We have to come to Him by faith. Guard your hearts so that you don't develop the same type of attitude as the Pharisees, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Guard your hearts. Wholeheartedly seek Christ. Pursue Him. And be wholly committed to building His church, regardless of those who would seek to hinder. God bless you.